So apologies for the loud wind noises. My windows have a leak and there's some crazy high wind speeds right now where I'm living. It's one of the reasons why I'm wearing a winter coat and another light fall coat underneath. Because my apartment's really cold. But without any further ado, we're going to get right into what we're here for, which is The Trial and Death of Socrates, written by Plato. For a book that's sub 60 pages, like this edition sits at 58, it's jam packed of important information. And I'm going to be giving a basic analogy, a basic breakdown. And for those of you who have never read it, I highly suggest you do. For those of you who have read it but don't have an edition, this one's not in the public domain, so you'll have to buy it off of the actual Amazon link below. But for those of you who haven't read it, I'll give you a quick and dirty summary before I get into a basic analysis. Quick and dirty summary is essentially three major points. You have one, it's Plato's wrote the Apology as a eyewitness account. Two, Socrates took a rather frivolous approach to his defense, and as a result, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. So that's your quick, dirty summary. That if you have no interest in reading it, there you go. Quick and dirty summary. Now, when getting into the actual meat and bones, the entire book, you have to put into perspective that it was written by Plato and not Socrates. All of Plato's stuff, when he talks about Socrates, is written by him. So as much as I try to keep everything sucked into just this book in particular without getting into any other of Plato's writings, there are some aspects of this book that I will be going into other writings by Plato, because it's important to understand with this trial. I'll for the future videos, for future products, I do plan to keep it isolated to the chapter, to the book. But for this, you have to understand that Plato's apology was written, or sorry, Socrates' apology was written by Plato as an eyewitness account. And the other part is the word apology used throughout this book is not Socrates apologizing in the sense as we would, as in being sorry, but it's more in the Athenian classical courts. It's the prosecution delivered what's called a categora, while the defense gave what's called an apologia. Now, so the apologia is essentially Socrates' defense. So whenever you people say, "Oh, this is Socrates' defense," or not Socrates' defense, Socrates' apology, it's Socrates' defense. That is the most important part to get through. Now, Socrates' defense throughout this trial was completely, blatantly inappropriate for the court setting and comes across as pompous and arrogant, which is a massive reason why he ends up getting sentenced to death. As Socrates lives as Socrates dies. That's essentially what this entire trial is. He doesn't give a crap. He's a 70-year-old man. He's lived his life. He knows he's not going to live much longer. So throughout this entire trial, he uses his same arguments, his same tactics, everything that he has done throughout his life, he throws into this trial, which is... There's a difference between a rhetorical speech and regular casual speech, as anybody would be able to tell you, that in sitting inside of a court case, it's probably not the best idea to be using casual speech. You might want to tailor your words when it could be mean your life. Socrates didn't give a crap, and it resulted in his death. Spoiler alert if you didn't get it from the title alone. Now, if you look at the jury votes, he was so arrogant, Socrates, that people who voted for him to be innocent not only chose to vote for him to die, or let me rephrase that, that the people who voted for him to be innocent were the ones that also voted for him to be put to death. Because the way the Athenian court system worked was the defense gives you each have your defense, and then once the guilt has been determined, the defendant says, "This is what I believe I'm guilty of. You guys have determined that I'm guilty, so I'm going to do X, Y, Z." to as reparations. Well, prosecutors say that's not good enough. I want ABC instead. So in this case, Socrates offered like pocket change. So he's basically insulted them within it. And obviously the prosecutors are like, no, we want you dead. Like we don't like you. We want you gone. The people, he was so insulting throughout this trial that even those who had voted for his innocence had changed their vote from, rather than saying, yes, give him the minor crime, they had said, sentence him to death. And like, all of this is you can get across is after Plato spices up his dialogue and spices up the rhetoric to make Socrates sound better. Because, let's be frank, this is written after the fact. As much as it is an eyewitness account, it's still Socrates being Socrates. Sorry, it's still Plato being Plato and wants to make Socrates look really, really good, and his prosecutors look really bad. You have to put that in perspective. So, now that we're going to get into the actual meat of the story on here, Socrates was charged and accused of both impiety and of corrupting the youth. So the charge of impiety is essentially atheism or heresy. So the charge of heresy was not just for his claim to be listening to and heeding the warnings of a daemon. Whether he thought that the actual daemon was directing him, or this was his way of describing his inner sense of intuition. In either case, this was not present in the Greeks' religion. And the other thing on there that he was charged with was, the big reason why he was charged with heresy was the Oracle of Delphi was one of the most important things within the Greek religion, that it's essentially whatever they say can do no wrong. Now, Socrates had one of his friends, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, and I didn't write it down in my notes, unfortunately, here. But Socrates' friend went to the Oracle of Delphi and asked, essentially, who is the wisest man of all. And the Oracle replied, none is wiser than Socrates. Socrates hears this claim, he's shocked to hear the answer, and he uses this claim to go out on a mission to test this statement. Essentially, what Socrates is saying right here is that I'm disagreeing with the word of the god and essentially the oracle of the gods, and I'm going to find out and prove that they are wrong. Now, you can't just do that. That's a fundamental pillar in their religion. And it can also be argued that Socrates is appearing to speak more of the heavenly aspects of his religion, as seen within the daemon on there, of the actual feeling and the belief in the gods and whatnot, rather than speaking exclusively of the gods and the power behind, for example, Zeus. And the charge of impiety is more intertwined with corrupting the youth. And I've even heard it argued, and it's quite interesting, I'll bring it up here as well. I'm curious what everybody thinks in the not in the description, what everybody thinks, and if you could comment below on what you think of this, because I find it quite interesting, and I would like to delve deeper into it. But that the charge of impiety is actually closer intertwined with corrupting the youth, and to be borderline treated as treason. Now, that's a hard take on there. Atheism treated as treason? How can that be? When you actually look at the ancient Athenian religion, religion is not a spiritual matter as it is today. Today, it's all about your belief and your personal relationship with God. Back then, it wasn't so simple, because Zeus was essentially the embodiment of the idea of kingship, or essentially the idea of the divine right of kings. Now, this essentially gives him, as a result, he's considered to be if I could speak, words aren't working today apparently, he was considered to be the protector of government. So when your head god is considered to be the protector of your governmental system, putting this into context, not putting it into context, I'm getting ahead of myself here. When your god is considered to be the head of your protectorate of your governmental system, to go against and to be against your actual gods and to speak against them and the fundamental pillars of your religious system is to go against the fundamental pillars of your actual governmental system. People will say, well, that has nothing to do with anything, but when you look at Socrates himself, and this is where I'm going to get outside of the actual book, because it's not as shown within the actual trial and death. Socrates himself was incredibly, or I'm getting actually still getting a little ahead of myself. Athens, with a bit of history and context here, Athens had just reinstated democracy after their surrender to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, a war that Socrates had fought in. Now, that's an important distinction. He had fought in this war as a hoplite, as many other Athenian citizens, as was their duty. Now, Socrates himself was a massive critic of democracy. He essentially took a crap all over democracy throughout all of his teachings, and the youth are listening to him, and everybody's listening to him. Now, when you're basically taking a crap and undermining the fundamental pillars of your governmental system, you are in effect going and undermining Zeus, because he is the protectorate of this governmental system that has been put into place. So it's argued on there, and I'm curious what other people think about this, is that Socrates' charge of impiety has more depth to it than just the you've been charged with atheism. Now, people were also genuinely suspicious of Socrates, seeing him as sympathetic to Sparta, who essentially, after the Peloponnesian War, had puppeted Athens, and they saw him as a direct threat to democracy, both into what he was saying and both into his actions. So because he's teaching the youth about the destruction of, or about the dangers of democracy on there, they're seeing him as, you're fundamentally doing a bad thing here. And I can see why the Athenians wanted to get rid of the man. It doesn't mean you agree with getting rid of him, but you can see their thought process and to why. Now, when you also take that, plus the refuting of the oracle's claims, that it's very hard to defend Socrates on here, that he is not being impious. He may say that he's believing in the spirits and the children of the gods and all these other things, but it is actually hard to see when you look at the religious context and the beliefs within the religion that he is being essentially impious. Would I use that to give the man a sentence of guilt? No. That's so minor. He believes in a minor aspect of religion. He's not a deeply, deeply religious man, and is the way I would view it, but I wouldn't call him impious. Now, when you go into the charge of the corruption of the youth, Socrates was popular with young men coming from influential families who often imitated him, and that's where the belief that he was corrupting the youth comes from, because considering when you have a bunch of young, rich men from powerful families starting to act the same way as him, and they don't like him, you can see where they are arguing that you're corrupting the youth and turning them against the fundamental pillars of Athens, or the fundamental people of Athens. And because he was also a fundamental, as I said earlier, massive critic of democracy, and because the youth were listening to him, they were believing that he was turning the youth against the fundamental pillars of Athenian society. And people began to ask the question, how can exposing the lack of wisdom and important people be good for Athens? Essentially, they started to do exactly what Socrates did. They asked questions. And essentially, once they started to ask these questions, it didn't look good for Socrates, because they wanted to get rid of him one way or another. And he was convicted within this entire trial for being seen as a pompous know-it-all, and to be quite frankly, he was being a bit of a prick. Now, before people rip me to pieces for this analogy, because considering you have to understand that Socrates himself had called himself a gadfly to the horse of Athens. He had to keep irritating it and nibbling at it, to keep it alert and to prevent laziness and complacency. Essentially, Socrates is saying, I had to be that prick that kept waking you up and throwing stones at you because you will not wake up on your own and you will not work on your own into fixing the fundamental problems that are in this state. By doing this, you may hate me like any horse hates a gadfly, but I am necessary to making you continue in your society. That is what Socrates argued. Now, it can be seen as a good thing, it can be seen as a bad thing. But whether you argue whether it's good or bad, the main thing that you have to agree on is nobody likes a mosquito and nobody likes being bitten by flies and being annoyed. And that is what fundamentally brought Socrates down. Because he kept using this thing called the Socratic method, for those of you who aren't aware, what the Socratic method is, it's not simply just asking questions like a 2-year-old child saying, oh, but what about now, but what about now? It's asking questions and asking different questions, or even the same question phrased similar different ways or in different contexts to eventually produce an inevitable contradiction. And this makes people appear to look like a fool or a fraud or both. And Socrates did this publicly, and he did it publicly to important people and leaders in society, making them both look stupid and like frauds. And you do that to too many powerful people, they're going to want to get rid of you. And this is where also it goes back to the Athenian people's question of how can exposing the lack of wisdom of important people be good for the city? You're basically making all Athenian important people look like stupid fools. How is this good for the city? Because you're essentially saying everybody's a fool and everybody's stupid, so then what, we shouldn't design a society? And because of this Socratic method, many were arguing that it's far easier to ask questions than to stake an actual physical claim. As a result, many believe that Socrates was just trying to show off his intelligence and make others look dim-witted. And he also, by doing this, they believed that he was not exposing himself to rhetoric. And he was not exposing himself to the same method because he wasn't physically asking any questions. I said that wrong. He wasn't physically staking a claim. He was just asking questions and destroying and dismantling other people's claims. Now, because of this, many people were calling Socrates a sophist. Now, sophists were essentially teachers that charged a fee to teach rich young men virtue and excellence at a cost. These teachings were mostly, when you look at it, were mostly used to teach how to use argument and persuasion to obtain and retain power. Socrates argues that he was not a sophist. He was different, because considering as much as he used the same techniques, he did not charge a physical fee, and that sophists claimed to possess wisdom, whereas he claimed to be a philosopher. And a philosopher as an important distinction, was a lover of wisdom, but does not possess wisdom. Essentially, a philosopher seeks wisdom, but does not currently hold it. Now, the other important distinction that he had claimed was another important distinction between sophists and philosophers, and that was sophists just strove to win arguments, whatever the merits of the case, rather than seek the truth. Now, you can see from this that Socrates has now made an enemy of important people, powerful people, and now very intelligent people that teach powerful and important people. He had made way too many enemies. And if you make an enemy of everyone, doesn't matter how many you're going to bring in to help you out, to believe you're doing nothing. If too many powerful people want you dead, this has been true throughout history, you will end up dead. It's a sad fact of reality. And he was executed fundamentally for this reason. He had a very close guilty verdict. I unfortunately didn't write down the numbers for this. I should have. I apologize. If anybody has exact numbers, please post them in a comment, and I'll put them into the description when I see them. He had a very close guilty verdict. Socrates, however, even with this, he would have never gone to court ever had he not made an enemy of every public figure. It would have never gone to court. They would have just dismissed him as, you know what, he's an intelligent man, but we may not like him. But because he made an enemy of every single one of them and publicly made them out to be fools, he essentially made them have to take him out. Because in the game of life, and in the game of power, essentially, everybody's in it for themselves, and if somebody keeps hacking you down a peg, the unfortunate reality is you have to strike back. And that's precisely what they did. Does that mean you agree with the method? No. But that's the fundamental nature of the cruel world that we live in. Had he not also insulted the institutions of the courts with his offer of, when he had initially been determined guilty, he had said, what do I deserve? I deserve to have free food for the rest of my life as punishment for... yeah, that's not going to go over well. So he goes, yeah, well, you're probably not going to accept that. So here's a couple of, pocket change I have on there. Hope you enjoy. That'll turn a large chunk of the people, and it did, who voted saying, he's not guilty. Leave him alone. He's not guilty. He's Socrates. Leave him alone. They all decided not to take his charge, considering that was quite frankly insulting to them and insulting to the court system. That they had changed, or they had essentially voted, who had said, you are not guilty, who had in mass said, no, sentence him to death. Like that, you're determined guilty, don't insult the court further. And that's exactly what he did. But why did Socrates do this? One can argue, and I can see it, that he knew he was a dead man. You have to remember, Socrates is 70 years of age. He lived through the Peloponnesian War. He lived through the reinstatement of democracy in Athens. He's lived a long life, and in this time period, he's probably not going to live much longer. So what does he care? You're going to sentence me to death? What does it matter? I'm going to die tomorrow probably anyway. So who cares? Kill me. But not only because of his age, he knew, fundamentally I believe he did know that he was going to die because he had made too many enemies in powerful positions. And he had given a warning to Athens as a result, saying that this will not end with my death. If you think getting rid of me will stop this, it's only going to be worse. Because he had held back the youth throughout Athens from doing the same as he was. So if he's holding them back, what happens if he's dead? And now you have a ton of youth who have been taught by him, who have been learning by him, and trying out the same methods as him, now have no one holding their reins. That's a deep threat. And he left them with that. And you can kind of see what happened throughout history of the amount of philosophers that have come after Socrates. He's an important ones like Aristotle, who had learned underneath him. But to conclude this, Socrates' death, when you read this entire book, was his own fault. But you have to respect him, because despite it was his own fault, he at least faced his death the same way he lived. He took it, he went up, took his poison, drank it, and died. Didn't care. Went into his trial that he knew he's probably going to die into before he went in, and treated it the same way as he did when he has his conversations on the street. Yes, he insulted the other rhetoricians that were speaking with them by using their own tactics against them, by professing his lack of skill in speech. He knew what was going to happen. He knew the outcome of this. That's one of the reasons why he insulted the court with his punishment suggestion. With that said, let me know what everybody thinks out in the description below. I'm always curious to read more about these different philosophical books. The next book that I'll be looking at in a chapter by chapter analysis will most likely be The Republic by Plato. It may not be 100% what I'll be looking at, but as of right now, it's looking like The Republic is what I'm going to be hitting on. So let me know what you guys think below, and have a good one, guys. Take care.